Chapter 10. We reached the beach, disembarked, and walked across the sandy waterside. To do so we had to sidestep discarded carpetbags, crates, casks, and bales, plus sacks of what appeared to be spilled coffee and spoiled flour. Beyond that we reached a wide mud path. "Montgomery Street," Father announced. A street? Barely. Not one cobblestone, but merely dirt, reduced in many places to a muddy quagmire. In wonder I reached down to touch the gummy sludge. This slubber was everywhere 2 and sometimes 3 feet deep. I, who was too often like a spouting dictionary, was reduced to muteness. As far as I could see, San Francisco did not have any real streets, nothing like Providence. Instead, lanes 2 feet wide wound among a hodgepodge of shops, eating houses, plus whatever people called home. There were gambling establishments everywhere I looked, a quantity sufficient to challenge my mathematical reckoning. Nor could I begin to count how many drinking places, saloons, and doggeries I observed. The air was heavy with clouds of whiskey vapor. As for my ears, they were filled with a constant clamor, sounds of squabbling voices, shouts, and sometimes disturbing screams. Many shops had signs telling what they sold, but in such a litany of languages I could not begin to guess what they offered. I had the odd sensation that we had arrived not in a different country, but in many different countries, all squashed together. In short, my senses, sight, hearing, and touch were disordered. My primary state of mind, bepuzzlement. All the same, Jacob and I followed Father up a steep hill, which he chose to call Sacramento Street. In so doing, we were required to avoid broken tubs and chests, as well as thrown away goods and rubbish, including what appeared to be a discarded open iron safe. The lack of storage space, Father explained, required goods to be stored outside. Theft, he assured us, I cannot say how he knew, was rare. A few sections of the muck-covered streets had narrow wooden planks upon which to tread. When we stepped on such, they sank into the ooze with a gross sucking sound. The street filth required me to hold up my skirts, which became grimy anyway. The sludge oozed between my toes, so that my shoes, I was sure, were ruined. In truth, walking proved so difficult, I resolved that when we got to our new house, my man's boots must be used. To my further disgust, I saw a multitude of scurrying rats, gray, black, and white ones with disturbingly pink eyes. Seeing us, these creatures lifted their revolting, bewhiskered snouts without fear, and sniffed as we passed as if to say, "This is our place. What are you doing here?" Adding to this awfulness was a bothersome breeze, which coated all with dust, enough to thicken my hair. I could feel it happen, and resolved to wash it as soon as possible. To add to everything, the city truly stank. As we went on, we continually had to make our way through crowds that consisted of mostly men. It made me feel odd. What kind of world had I come to? Had women and girls been banished? Yes, the passengers on the Stephanie K had been almost all males, but here was a city of men, and none appeared older than 30 years of age. I confess it gave me considerable unease. These men were not attractive. Each man different perhaps, but all had in common dirty, ill-kempt beards, along with uncut hair that made them look like shabby porcupines. They also dressed much the same: broad-brimmed slouch hats, red or blue flannel shirts, and corduroy trousers tucked into heavy boots. What's more, they carried either a Colt pistol or a bowie knife in their belts, sometimes both. It was as if the city were occupied by a bandit army. There were many others who dressed in somewhat different fashion, I suppose Mexicans and Chinese, and who spoke their own language. "Who are all these men?" I asked. "Miners," murmured Father. Have I made myself clear? I was aghast by all I saw. Where, I wondered, was the spirit of gentle St. Francis from whom the city took its name? I confess my courage faltered. I could all but hear, "What would Aunt Lavinia say to this?" In haste I scolded myself. I was in San Francisco, thousands of miles from Providence. This was the destiny my will had given me. There was no way I could go back. We would get to our new house, and I would hide away. Jacob, also struggling through the mud, called out once, twice, 3 times. "Are we close?" Father said, "We need to reach California and Stockton streets." I was finding it hard to believe that there was any such streets, when Father abruptly announced, "Here we are, home." Baffled, Jacob and I looked around. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Where? What?" "Right in front of you," said Father. "This tent." A tent. The tent Father pointed to was made of what appeared to be old brown sailcloth, patched enough to have been a beggar's cloak. Its roof was held up by a crooked wooden branch in the middle, so that it was some 5 feet in height. Its walls were kept down by stakes. The inner floor, no more than 8 feet by 8 feet, was naught but dirt. I was reminded of pictures I'd seen of Egyptian pyramids. It might have been as old. Yet Father had called it home. Jacob, his voice as full of shock as were my thoughts, asked, "Are we going to live here?" "Until," said Father, "I return from the goldfields and purchase something better." It cost only $100. He spoke with pride, as if he had made a great bargain. As I would learn, he had. Let it be said, there were many other tents to all sides of ours in which people were living. But not all. Right across from our tent, separated by nothing more than a muddy 20-foot strip, was what appeared to be an eatery. It was in fact a huge wooden box propped up by a number of barrels. Over the open window there was no door. Written words proclaimed, "San Francisco Cafe Restaurant." Standing inside this odd structure behind a wooden plank was a man. Rather small, he had a leathery dark face and black hair, along with a welcome smile. "Bienvenidos," he called from across the way. "I am Senor Rosales, and I am glad to have you in nuestro barrio. We shall be amigos. Do you speak Spanish? No? Que triste. It shall be my personal pleasure to teach you." When he spoke, he rolled his R's so they rumbled softly. The most pleasing sound to touch my ear since arriving in San Francisco. Father stepped across the way, shook hands with the man, and introduced himself and us. "Mr. Randolph Blydell, my son, Master Jacob, my daughter, Miss Victoria." "How wonderful!" cried the Señor. "I have 2 children as well. But, Señor," he said, his voice suddenly filled with caution, "I must tell you, San Francisco is not a good place for niños. They are like corderos, lambs, not safe. You may be sure there are lobos about, wolves. May I offer you some desayuno, breakfast?" He was being so kind, warning us about the city, giving us lessons in Spanish, and offering breakfast all at once. "Thank you," said Father, "but we need to move into our new home." I was in fact quite hungry, but we retreated to that tent, our home. That home took little time to organize. Furnishings consisted of 3 beds, blankets over boards, and our baggage, which was soon delivered at more high cost, plus a discarded biscuit box that Jacob found not far off in the muddy street. He dragged it in and set it down in the middle where it served for a table. All too quickly then the 3 of us were sitting in that tent, the front flaps down. The air was stultifying, the smell rather like a rank washcloth. At first no one spoke because, I suspect, we didn't know what to say or do. It was as if we had traveled to X but had come to Y and weren't sure how it had happened. That's to say, though we had traveled across the world, we knew not where we were and hardly knew what came next. The look on Jacob's face was one of great perplexity. Now and again he reached out and touched the tent's cloth wall as if not believing it was real. Then he would look at Father, then at me, as if we might have something to say. We did not. Father, though he tried to hide it, seemed equally unsure of himself. More than once he consulted his pocket watch as if to suggest that he might have an appointment. Most assuredly he did not. As for me, I was mortified. I realized I had believed in larger-than-life dreams. I, too, I acknowledge, had succumbed to gold fever. Restored to health, I could see that the reality was altogether bizarre. "Father," I said at last, "I am filthy. How am I to wash? Where do we get water?" It will need to be fetched. I shall have to purchase some buckets. I looked about. And will I have no privacy? I said. I shall put up a curtain wall. Next day, Father secured a piece of old sail and strung it across one corner. So much for seclusion. Little that it was, I was thankful for it. We continued to sit for a while in silence, each of us in our own way, no doubt trying to make sense of where we were. At length I said, Father, what shall happen to us? Father pulled himself up, consulted his watch, and said, I've told you many times, I'll quickly make my fortune in gold, and then... He faltered. And then what? I said. He went on to paint an airy picture of the future that seemed to be a replication of what we'd had in Providence, soon to be rebuilt in San Francisco. A sweep of anger went through me. Dear Father, I said, speaking, I fear, like a book heroine in excessive distress, have we come so far, over such a long time, at such great expense and peril, cutting all ties with our past, only to make everything exactly what it was before? This world we've come to is different and new, but different in the most dreadful of ways. I concluded by saying, nay, demanding, yet again, what will become of us? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I have an obligation to your mother to regain our fortunes. I wanted to say, though did not, but what about us? When I realized that he had no answers, I felt a surge of anger. But as we sat there, my anger subsided. Because as I looked at Father, I understood that ire and resentment would do me little good. In its place came the realization that if Jacob and I were to survive, it would be me who needed to care for us. If ever there was a moment when your will shall decide your destiny, this was it. But let it be said, it is one thing to be transported to a different place. It is quite another thing to be transported to a different way of being. Had I not wanted change? Well, then vast change was now a necessity, but I had no idea how to make it happen.